Hey everyone, the Savage Worlds magic system is fundamentally different than D&D. So let's talk about that today and learn more about the magic system in Savage Worlds. Hey everyone, it's Carl with Tabletop Tango. Look at the bubbles, do the stuff, visit our website, contact, support. The more support we get, the more Savage World stuff we're going to buy. And you can get some of my swag products at on Drive-Thru RPG, and all the help would be appreciated. Also, we have a podcast, Eric and I, called Mastering the RPG, available wherever fine podcasts are found. So hopefully you'll enjoy some of those. So what do I want to talk about today? Today I basically want to talk about the magic system in Savage Worlds. We'll talk a little bit about how it's different than D&D, but in the end we're going to do an example of casting a power, which is what they're called in Savage Worlds. They're not called spells, they're called powers, and go through that process. So first thing is, how is Savage Worlds different than Dungeons and Dragons? Just to set everybody's, because most people know Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, you have spells that are very descriptive, very specific. They slot into spell slots that you get based on your level. You get the number of spells based on your level, and those slot in. Savage Worlds uses power points. So you spend power points, you spend these points to cast a spell, because spells cost, and like I said, spells are called powers, they cost a certain number of points. And so you spend those points, you roll a skill die, powers go off. So what are some of the other things? Powers use trappings. So in D&D, you have this huge list of spells that are all very, very specific. They do specific things. In Savage Worlds, the list is much shorter, and powers are more generic. What makes a power different is the trappings that you put into it. So for example, in D&D, you've got magic missile, acid arrows, lightning bolt, stuff like that. And they're all basically doing damage at a distance, at range. In Savage Worlds, they have one power called bolt. And that bolt represents, through trappings, can represent all those different types of spells specifically. So a bolt can be a magic missile, for example, if the trappings are just a bolt of power. If your trappings could be, you have a bunch of bees fly out of your finger and go attack the foe, that would be perfectly okay as far as a trapping for bolt. Powers can have modifiers in Savage Worlds. So a modifier changes sort of the power in a subtle way. So in the case of Bolt, for example, there is the additional damage modifier where you can spend additional power points to do more damage with the power. And that's true for a lot of powers. There's also generic, and I'll talk about that. There's also generic modifiers. But the point is, a spell is a little more customizable in Savage Worlds. Powers can be tweaked based on the circumstances that you have. The last thing is, powers don't go just off automatically. In D&D, some spells sometimes, you cast it, it goes off. That's just how it is. In Savage Worlds, powers have a skill that you roll, and you need to get above 4, just like any other skill roll in Savage Worlds. And if you roll successfully, the power goes off. If you don't roll successfully, you spend a power point, but the spell doesn't go off, the power doesn't go off. And you can see I'm using spell and power interchangeably, but they're called powers in Savage Worlds, so I apologize for that. That's kind of one extra step that goes into using the powers. Now, Savage Worlds, you can use a power over and over again as long as you've got power points, and you can cast multiple powers in the same round as long as you use the multi-action penalty. So there's a little more flexibility, I think, in the powers, with trappings and all that stuff in Savage Worlds versus Dungeons and Dragons. So let's talk about a little more of the basics of what a spellcaster is in Savage Worlds. The ability to cast powers is defined on whether you have an edge called an Arcane Background. Now, Arcane Backgrounds in the core book are really geared around kind of the classic tropes. So you have things like wizard, sorcerer kind of folks. You can have miracles background, which is kind of that cleric-y. You can have psionics. You can have people who are called gifted, where they have limited powers, but it's kind of like ingrained in them, and you can, those tropes where somebody has that built-in power. Maybe they don't really understand it, but they can use it effectively. There's also an arcane background that allows you to build like crazy devices that are used to project your powers, and that's called weird science. So there's a lot of variety there. Settings modify that, add their own arcane background. So that's part of what makes settings in Savage Worlds interesting, is they can tweak those things. They can make arcane backgrounds that are kind of specific to their setting. So for example, cyberpunk setting might have sort of a cybernetic damage dealing ninja kind of thing, and those might be represented, the capabilities might be represented as the powers. It's possible. So an arcane background has a couple of key attributes when you take that edge. First is the arcane skill. Like I mentioned, you need to roll a skill. So kind of a wizard type character would probably roll a skill called spellcasting. For miracles, you'd roll faith as your skill die. But you have a skill die. Every arcane background has a specific skill die that allows them to cast power and see whether it goes off. Second thing is there's a number of starting powers that an arcane background gets. Maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 3. And those can be picked from anything that are novice. And so powers, they have the same ranking like you might have for an edge. So you have things you can get at novice, things you can get at seasoned, things you can get at veteran. But at novice, you can pick the number of spells or powers that are in your list of starting powers. There's also starting power points. Starting power points is the number of points an arcane background gets at the beginning when that edge is chosen. It's a variety based on the kind of thing that you're doing. It could be 10 points, could be 20 points, could be 15 points. It all depends on the arcane background, all depends on the setting that you're using. So the last thing is then available powers. In the core book, it doesn't differentiate, but in settings, lots of times they're going to limit the powers. They might add additional powers, but they'll limit the powers based on the arcane background and what makes sense to it. So if you have a fantasy game that you're doing, you could limit the powers of the miracle to not include things like bolt or blast or those sorts of things. You could limit your sorcerer to not being able to have healing. That's kind of up to you or the setting, how it defines it. So arcane skill, starting powers, a number of them, starting power points, available powers. Now, as you progress, you can get edges, which would give you more power points, would give you more powers, and most casters take those. There's also other edges that tweak the powers, make them more effective, change the way that they work for you. Settings would obviously add their own set of power edges to kind of represent the flavor of the setting. So all that done, let's talk about an example of casting a power. So I mentioned Bolt, which is kind of like that magic missile and things like that, but we're going to use the example of Blast. Blast you can trap it in multiple ways, but it's an area of effect, explosion, power, whatever it is. So that's how you would make your fireball if that's what you wanted. That's what you might make for your ice storm that comes down and hits people in this radius. So let's talk about Blast. So each power has a cost, and that makes sense, right? Because we're spending power points. Blast has a cost of 3 points, basic points. So just to cast Blast, you're going to use 3 power points. One of the interesting things I mentioned is there's modifiers. And so those modifiers can be used to increase the cost, but also increase the interesting things about it. So Blast has a specific modifier that you can choose, which is a damage modifier, which allows you to increase the damage by 1d6. So we're going to want to do that because we want to do as much damage as we possibly can. That power modifier costs 2 points. And so we'll spend those 2 points. It adds in, now we have 5 points that we're going to spend out of our pool of power points. There's also, as I mentioned, generic ones. And generic ones can include things like additional range, might ultimately fatigue your opponent over time. It allows for selective hitting of like an area effect type one so that you don't hurt your foes that are in the blast radius. So there's a variety of them that generally apply to all the powers, and you can choose those whenever you cast a power. So you've got the specific modifiers for the power, and then you have the generic ones that you can pick. In our case, we've got like melee going on, everybody's side by side, and we're doing that close, close support for our troops. So we want to do selective so we don't hurt our allies that are in the blast radius. So selective costs 1 power point. And so we'll spend that. And so ultimately we have 6 points that we're going to spend to cast our power blast. And in this case, our trappings is a fireball. So it's going to blast a bunch of fire in this radius. So then we're going to roll our skill die, and we're looking for a 4. And so this is a wizardy sorcerer character, and so it's going to be spell casting. So they'll cast a spell or the power, and let's say they rolled a 6. And so 6 is a basic success, not a raise. And so they'll do their damage. This power normally does 2d6 damage. In this case, it's going to do 3d6 because we use the damage modifier, and it goes off. Now, if we fail, it costs a power point, but nothing really bad happens. If we get a critical failure, that's going to cause fatigue to our spellcaster, and any powers that are being maintained go away. So, and that's the basic core book. Most settings, I don't know, maybe not most settings, but a lot of settings change what Backlash does so that it's kind of tailored to the flavor. It could be worse, it could be more generous, what have you. So that's the basics of spellcasting. Now, to get back your power points, usually you rest and you get a set of power points back. It's dependent on a setting, how many you get. The core book, you get 5 back. So instead of D&D where you do that rest and you study your spells or you pray to your god, you just have to be taking time to rest. So now that's based on the game master, what rest means. I normally say as long as you're walking around and not doing anything super strenuous, you'd get those power points back after an hour. Some say you really do need to rest. It's a game master call, to be honest with you. And then, like I said, there's edges that affect powers, that give you more power points. That's the basics of powers, magic, and Savage Worlds. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty flexible because you've got trappings, because you've got modifiers. So you can do a lot of strategy and thinking about how you're going to build out your Arcane Background character. And it can be very, very specific, very flavorful based on those trappings. So it can be a lot of fun. So that's the Matrix system. Like I said, I'm Carl with Tabletop Tango. Look at the bubbles, do the stuff. The more you support, the more Savage World stuff we're going to buy to talk about, and we appreciate everything when you watch. So thanks for the support. Bye.